Welcome, traveler. I want to show you my experience of going through the British Library's fantasy realms of imagination. This exhibit basically is an introduction to the world of fantasy. As we probably know, hopefully you being a fantasy fan or nerd, fantasy has exploded. Now, something interesting someone told me was, they're looking at Dungeons and Dragons resurfacing, the Game of Thrones coming out, all the Lord of the Rings remakes and series, the Wheel of Time. Now, there is a massive resurgence of fantasy, but something we have to remember is that fantasy's always been there. I'm going to take you on a tour of me and my friend going through the Fantasy Expo. I believe I released this a little bit too late, but I think there's about a week left of this expo being open at the British Library. So if you haven't seen it and you haven't gone and you're in England or in London, go see this because it's really fun. Okay, here we go. So this was the entrance. Loads of people sitting around, probably students, researching, writing. I don't know what they were doing, but it was such a great atmosphere to see so many people sitting about, studying, being academic, having their coffees. One thing that I wasn't able to film was there's this huge glass bookcase with all these old leather tomes, massive books that line one of the walls. Really inspiring. Actually, after the exhibit, I sat there for an hour and I did a bunch of writing. I wrote 1,000 words in an hour. I'd have had a couple of drinks, might have helped, but really, really great. This was the entrance to the actual exhibit. These stairways that went down, super atmospheric. I loved the idea that it was down some steps like you're entering another world, maybe a dungeon, but the green really set the tone for this sort of fairy, fantastical landscape. Something that they did was they actually played sound effects throughout of, enchanted sounds and forest sound effects, which really put you in the mood. You're first greeted by the ancient map of fairyland. Now, I think this is such a great way to welcome the guests, as this map is probably about 2.5 meters big, long, and it includes all these kinds of fantastical places, fantastical people, going back to Peter Pan, King Arthur, loads of fairy tales. And my friend and I spent probably a good 10-15 minutes just amazed at all the small details and sort of laughing. And there's even a key showing different places like elfin treasure or secret caverns. It was great. The detail is amazing, and the artwork is sort of naive and really captures that innocence and people's love of maps. This is one of the main rooms where there's loads of books to see, old and new. There are costumes in the middle as well, which I will talk about in a moment. But along the entire way, there are often screens with headsets. You can listen to people talking about fantasy, mostly authors talking about their experience, their understanding of it, and their inspirations. So it was really quite an immersive experience. One of the first things that I'm going to be talking about, not necessarily in the order that it appears, but fantasy games came up quite a few times. As you can see here, there is a table with Warhammer. Anybody who's familiar with Games Workshop will know that Warhammer has been around for a very long time, I think since the 80s, and they love to lay out these battle scenes between epic armies. Now again, they've only shown Warhammer, not Warhammer 40,000, because we don't talk about sci-fi a lot on this channel, but maybe sometimes. So that was one thing. The next thing was obviously Dungeons and Dragons. They had the red box, the famous red box, as well as a few of the editions of Dungeons and Dragons, including Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which is the second edition, and the fifth edition of Dungeons and Dragons, which most people play nowadays, which I still believe is the best edition of Dungeons and Dragons so far. We can talk about that in another video. Towards the end of the expo, there was this picture frame full of Magic cards. Now, for anybody who plays Magic the Gathering, I found this particularly fascinating because it was one of the entire sheets before being cut, and they were all foil. And I'm not quite sure what edition they were from, but it must have been from one of the collector's editions, like Modern Horizons, or the ones that have all the special cards in them. I lost track of Magic the Gathering for a while, but still fascinates me. Something that they also included in this was a lot of props and costumes. Now, again, not in any order, but by theme. They showed some art from Lord of the Rings. Famous artist, I believe it's Alan Lee. They have props from the film, including Gandalf's pipe and the staff that was used in the actual filming of The Lord of the Rings. How cool is that? The next thing for any Dark Crystal fans is the concept art for the film, as well as the costumes of the Giflings, the costumes for the Giflings, including the actual crystal and one of the panpipes, which they called something bizarre. Now onto the books. Now, one of the great things about this, and again, the fantasy genre loves books, and there are loads of fantastic copies of books, collections of books, so I left this for closer to the end. So here we have the colored fairy books, and it is an incredible collection, so beautiful. Even just to have them and to see them arrayed would be wonderful. These fairy books were collected and edited by Andrew Lang. Good for you. This is all of Robin Hobb's writing. These are part of the collection and all of her trilogies and series of fantasy books, including the Farseer books, The Fitz and the Fool, The Living Ship Traders, Rain Wild Chronicles, and she's written so much, which is incredible, and I've only read one book, which is a shame, but I'll get on to them. This is just a beautiful copy, ancient copy of the Iliad. Now, not only did we look at the published books that existed, but they also, in their collection, being the British Library, they had the notebooks from loads of famous authors. And here we see Lewis Carroll with the depictions of Alice in Wonderland, as well as some illustrations by Mervyn Peake, who wrote the Gormenghast trilogy. We'll get to him. Now, this was C.S. Lewis's notebook and the maps that he drew for Narnia. And again, just to think about the author having held that and was writing this down, when you think about your own notebooks, it makes it so human and really creates a fantastic connection. One of the ones that I found the most fascinating, and I'm not sure why I found it so inspiring, probably because this author is so renowned, but Ursula Le Guin's notebooks and illustrations for the second story, which is the Tomb of Atuan book, the Tomb of the Tombs of Atuan. The illustrations are from the second book, the Tombs of Atuan, which is my favorite book. If you look in the front, there's a fantastic map. But here we see that there is an illustration of the ring that Jed was looking for, as well as what the little priestess girl can see when she looks down into the tombs and sees Jed lost in the maze. For me, it really inspired me to see just how delicately Ursula Le Guin wrote in these books. And again, just to look at different authors' writing processes, and to know that some people take quick notes and other people write entire novels in by hand. Now, talking about Mervyn Peake with the Gormenghast series, he was also known to be a great drawer, and his characters are so, as I said in a previous video, are such caricatures and so sort of grotesque and fascinating, and he drew them the way he saw them. An incredible talent to be able to write incredibly as well as draw, something I'm not very able to do. Now, there's lots of other things that I haven't looked at or told you much about, but one of the great things at the very end was the gift shop. Now, when you think about most museum gift shops, they tend to have a variety of random things, but they knew exactly how to cater to fantasy audience, because it was full of books and knickknacks, but mostly books. All of the books that they talk about in the exhibit you can actually buy. And my friend, while we were walking through, we actually found loads of recommendations. So we went away with new books to read. There were a number of Neil Gaiman books as well as a video of Neil Gaiman talking about his creation of the Sandman. There were some graphic novels as well, and really, again, presenting you with an opening to fantasy. And you can see the artwork and the effort that's been put into this to really capture your imagination. They've done a great job. Tales from Earthsea, of course, as well as something that I nearly bought was a little bar of soap with a set of dice in it, Dungeons and Dragons dice. Didn't buy it. Smelled really good. I just didn't go for it. And lastly, just in the little corner, I was able to find some Kudama, the little forest spirits from Princess Mononoke, which they also did show videos of that, really expanding the horizons of just how encompassing fantasy is and how far-reaching it has become. There was also a room where you can see me and my friend walking around with this special effect. The creepy part was there was some children being taught or were listening to a tour guide, and this theatrical voice kept booming in the air, and the laughter of children, which was quite creepy but quite fascinating too. And my friend, nicely enough, I was walking around and imagining what I could buy, and talking to him about what I would probably go for. And the one thing that I did stop at and I picked up, he was nice enough to sneak away and buy it for me because it had been my birthday, and it's this one. These are a collection of essays from each of the parts of the exhibit. Now, I picked this up, and I mean, first of all, it's this lovely big book, but I mentioned about it because I told him, this being an author, a fantasy author, you want to study fantasy. It says essays from the wide worlds of fantasy. This is what you need to study, actual essays about fantasy. And so when I wasn't looking, he bought it for me, and I'm so glad. Haven't read it yet because it's a big, chunky, and probably quite academic, but when I get around to it, I'm going to study this, and hopefully it will influence and help with my fantasy understanding. Overall, the exhibit was great. Now, as a fantasy nerd, I wasn't very surprised about what they showed us. There were some small tidbits that I learned about and I thought were interesting, but I feel like the exhibit was more for people who were curious about fantasy or had just started getting into it, and it gave a really nice detailed overview of what the fantasy world is, and how deep it goes. Generally, it was enjoyable. The sound effects and the atmosphere. My friend and I ended up staying quite a long time because it was that enjoyable. Now, this isn't the only thing that the British Library has done. In fact, they have been doing lots and lots of different events all around the UK. Author talks and other exhibits, get-togethers, one of which I actually went to, which was The Roots of Fantasy with the author panel talk. So that concludes my introduction and overview of fantasy realms of imagination from the British Library. Something I'm really proud that they've done, because it's quite amazing to really, pick up, the genre and bring it out there for people. And it just makes you realize that, we're not alone. We can all be nerds together and enjoy something without it being this secret. Nowadays, everybody enjoys fantasy, whether it's romantasy with The Fourth Wing, or The Courts of Thorn and Roses, or The Lord of the Rings, which everybody seems to love. So never fear that you're all alone. There are loads of allies lurking in the shadows. That sounds creepy. Anyway, safe travels. I'll see you next time.